So the purpose of this event today, right, really is to talk about the continued use of detention without trial in Singapore. This is particularly relevant not just because it's the 50th anniversary of Operation Coldstore, which was really the first major use of detention by the PAP government, as well as the single largest use of it, but also because the Criminal Law Temporary Provisions Act has just been renewed. So together with the ISA, these two laws permit detention without trial. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by providing historical context to talk about Operation Coldstore, to talk about this first use of detention without trial, and then we'll segue into a roundtable discussion about all the role of detention in Singapore today. But before I go on, I'd just like to point out that this year is also 50 years of the independence of Singapore. Now, the government will have you think that 1965 is the anniversary, but it's actually 1963. We became independent from the British Empire on 16th of September 1963, and I think it's really important that we remember that we entered into Malaysia as an independent, sovereign part of Malaysia, rather than continuing to be part of some sort of colonial structure. We were an independent country in '63, and we continue to be so after '65, but on our own instead of part of Malaysia. So this 50 years is also a great time to stop and reflect and take stock. So that's what I hope we can all do today. So let's start with the basics. All right, what is Operation Coldstore? It was launched about 1:25 a.m., 2nd of February 1963, and on that very first day, 111 people were arrested and detained without trial. Most of these people included all the leaders of Singapore's opposition. All the capable leaders of Singapore's political opposition were detained indefinitely, some, like Dr. Poh, for decades. All right, and it wiped out Singapore's progressive left. It wiped out a lot of the opposition in Singapore. At the time, Singapore's internal security was in the hands of an Internal Security Council, which comprised 3 members of the Singapore government, 3 members of the British colonial government, and 1 member from the Federation of Malaya. Their explanation for why the arrest happened was basically communism, violence, and it was anti-Malaysia. But the problem is, right, in the historiography, in our historical understanding, we see these events through the eyes of the British, through the eyes of the English-speaking leaders of the PAP. It's a very one-sided historiography, and it's a major issue for us to be able to have any sort of really clear understanding of these events, that we also bring in other voices, other perspectives. So we don't actually know what the Barisan believed. We don't know what the progressive left believed. So one of my goals with my talk today really is to try and help us understand what were the beliefs of the Barisan, why did they act the way they did, why did they make the choices that they did, and then try and resituate them into the broader narrative of merger and Malaysia. To begin with, let's look at our main actors. Can everyone see these clearly? Everyone good? Over there on the your top left is Commissioner Selkirk, who was the British proconsul, the plenipotentiary in Singapore. Right, top right, Tunku Abdul Rahman, the first Prime Minister of independent Malaya. Bottom left, our friend Mr. Lee. And bottom right, Lim Chin Siong, the spiritual leader of the progressive left, the intellectual leader, and also Secretary General of the Barisan Sosialis. Now, to give some structure to what I'm going to talk about, okay, I'm going to go into a bit of theory. Don't be daunted, all right? It's very basic. But I'm going to start by talking about the work of early 20th century sociologist Karl Mannheim. Now, for Mannheim, right, he defined a generation as being born from shared historical disruption. People are disproportionately influenced by the events that happen to them in their most malleable plastic years, so the late teens to mid-20s. So what defines a political generation is the history that people experience during those years. And it's important to note that a generation has no set length. All right, you can have a generation every year, you can have it one every 100 years. But what matters is that people experience during their lifetime a defining event. that ends up defining that generation. And this defining event is different from the defining event that defines the next generation and the previous generation. Also, people can experience the same very formative events, but have very different responses to it. So as a basic example, think of the Thatcher years in Britain, right? Very formative, defining event, but people responded to it in such drastically different ways. So, let's then, with this in mind, take a look at the events in Singapore from around the year 1930. What we see is a pattern of systemic discrimination and repression of Singaporeans, particularly of the Chinese-speaking. They grew up in a time where not only does the colonial state fail to protect them economically and politically, but the resources of the state are turned against them. Repression, discrimination, and violence, again and again and again. So, to be Chinese-speaking in Singapore in 1949 is, in my mind, not that far from being Palestinian in East Jerusalem today. You're a second-class citizen in the land of your birth. Obviously, this comparison, is problematic, but I think it gives you an idea of the kind of discrimination and state violence that is turned on you. So, for someone like Lim Chin Siong and his friends Chen Se-James and Fong Swee Swan, they were at Chinese High together, and they experienced this firsthand in 1951. The government ordered them to take a useless exam, right? It had no purpose. It would not help them go on to the next level, would not have any influence on their grades. The government just decided, you need to take this exam. And they protested, and they said no. And for their pains, they were detained. Some of their friends were tortured, and at the exam, 80 of them out of over 100 turned in blank exam scripts and were all promptly expelled. So because of this very arbitrary act, their livelihoods were destroyed. Right? They could no longer get decent jobs, they couldn't go to university. Instead, Lim Chin Siong ends up becoming a bus conductor. Their prospects are completely ruined. So the same happens to other members of this generation. Let's have a look at the Barisan Sosialis Central Committee here. Okay, and let's refine this list. Let's take out anyone who wasn't on the Operation Coldstore arrest list. And if you look at it closely, basically everyone arrested at Operation Coldstore was born in a narrow 5-year period centered around 1932. So you have a very strong political generation who are all defined by a long shared historical experience. And this historical disruption defines them. It defines what they believed. It defines how they felt and against the colonial state. But they overcame this discrimination. They overcame this oppression, and they pushed back against the government. So the government won't let you study in the University of Malaya? Fine, we'll start our own university, Nanyang University. The government encourages the exploitation of wage labor? Fine, we'll organize the trade unions, we'll strike, and we'll vote in a labor-friendly government at the first opportunity, which is what happened in 1955. And in that same year, you see the first legislation which actually protects the rights of workers. And in that same year, you see all these strikes which actually win important concessions from employers for workers. So it is because of this immense strength of this organization that they build up in the 50s that the PAP then ends up winning the elections in 1959. But by the time the PAP wins these elections in 1959, many of these same people are behind bars. The government, the colonial government, is able to destroy a lot of their gains by using violence and oppression against them. In 1956, they stopped the first multi-ethnic civil rights movements in its tracks by just arresting all the leaders and locking them away for several years. The laws which enabled this, of course, were the internal security laws. So the lesson that this generation drew from this is that it doesn't really matter what you do, as long as the British hold on to internal security laws. No matter what other powers they cede, they can just stop you in your tracks. And they will continue to govern Singapore for the benefit of the British electorate, the British economy, not the Singaporean electorate and Singaporean economy. So it doesn't really matter what aspect of life in Singapore you're talking about. The detainee issue, the internal security issue, is not just a political issue. It impacts every single aspect of your life in Singapore. So it doesn't matter what the issue is, right? It doesn't matter whether you succeed, unless it doesn't matter whether you succeed if the British can just arrest what they want. So when they get out in 1959, their number one priority is to put the internal security laws in the hands of a locally elected, fully democratic government that is completely responsible to the people of Singapore. That's their number one priority, along with, of course, releasing the political detainees who are already behind bars. Note here that they don't actually call for the abolition of the laws, but instead, if the people of Singapore want these laws, that's fine, but it has to be in the hands of a government which is democratically elected and fully representative and responsible to the people of Singapore. Without this, there can be no economic progress, no educational progress, nothing. But having gotten the PAP elected, and throughout their first year, they try to work with the PAP leadership. But the problem is, throughout the course of the first year, the PAP really make a hash of things. There is a lot of poor performance. As Lisa mentioned, they're revolutionaries. They come out and they implement a lot of policies quickly, designed to make a lot of changes. But this leads to policy implemented in haste and then regretted at leisure. There's a lot of embarrassing U-turns. Crime goes up the first year, wages go down, the housing situation remains critical. Most notably, there's the sudden revocation of the Trades Unions Bill. After the PAP members, led by Lim Chin Siong, put in so much effort to reorganize the trade union movement, the government realizes that they can't control the trade union movement, that it could become an alternative power base. So even though the Trade Unions Bill has already been passed, right, the PAP cabinet orders Yusof Ishak not to sign it and pulls the whole thing back and destroys all this hard work for the first year. So there's a lot of frustration and anger in the rank and file of the PAP. But it's not limited to just them. This is what the British said. Okay, I'll give you a moment to have a look at it. There's a lot of frustration. They acknowledge the PAP leadership has a difficult job. They have to balance the interests of capital, of companies, versus the interests of labour and of the people of Singapore. They have to balance the interests of the British colonial power versus the Singapore people. They have to keep promises that they made in the election campaign. But all these difficulties are compounded by this attitude. There's no internal democracy in the PAP. There's no consultation of experts. The leadership is arrogant, they're smug, they know the best thing to do, they don't want to listen. So by the end of 1959, early 1960, there's actually criticism within the PAP, internal criticism in the PAP newsletter by Woodhull and Puducherry, who write that the policies are generally correct, but we would really appreciate it if the leadership would have a more consultative style of government and listen to their membership more. And in response, Lee Kuan Yew and Rajaratnam then take this public and they say, they criticize Woodhull and Puducherry very harshly, and they say, Lee Kuan Yew says, oh, in our party, the cream rises to the top, but bits of scum also float to the top. And of course, the British are also very frustrated with Lee Kuan Yew, who epitomizes this problem. And it's a source of concern to them, his arrogance. They say, he's so obsessed with power, right? Selkirk says the only subject I've ever heard Lee talk about with any sense of feeling is the subject of power. It's an obsession with him. And it's a huge source of concern for the British. But even all this would be okay, except for the big issue, detainees. Now, you recall in 1959, the PAP campaigned explicitly that they would release political detainees when they assumed office. And before they released Lim Chin Siong and a few of his colleagues on that first day, right? Lim and his colleagues said, you have to release all of us. And Lee said, I can't do that, but I promise you I will release everyone else. So that promise being made, they agreed to be released. And then the releases then happened throughout 1959, but in smaller and smaller and smaller batches. And so by early 1960, no one was being released. And the rank and file of the PAP, the progressive left of the PAP, then got a bit frustrated and said, what happened? Why are our colleagues not being released? In June 1960, the PAP sought to remove the highest source of dissent within the party, and that was Minister for National Development, Ong Eng Guan. He's a full minister, right? And so, they targeted him first. Now, Ong responded by trying to rally the PAP progressive left, and he introduced 16 resolutions at a party meeting, of which the first concrete resolution was the release of detainees. Now, the PAP left don't really have any love lost for Ong, right? They're not a fan, but they do take the opportunity to ask Lee Kuan Yew to clarify his stand on the detainee issue. And when Lee refuses, when he evades the issue, and over time it becomes more and more clear that he's not going to press for the release of the remaining detainees, this isn't a minor issue to them. This, if you remember, it strikes at the very heart of what it means to be a colonized people. If the detainees, if the use of detention without trial is the expression, the manifestation of colonialism in Singapore, then the continued support of detention without trial and the continued detention of political prisoners is the support of colonialism. And to support colonialism, especially from a supposedly anti-colonial leader, is betrayal of the highest order. So finally, Ong Eng Guan in January 61 resigns his seat, and there's going to be a by-election in Hong Lim. And so Lee Kuan Yew is on shaky ground with his grassroots, his backbenchers, the PAP's progressive left, the trade union base. But he's not worried. Why? Because, as he freely admitted later, he had struck a deal with the Malayan Communist Party for their support for the Hong Lim by-election. And that is why the PAP puts up a very strange candidate for Hong Lim, Jack Yen Thum, a Cantonese speaker in a heavily Hokkien-speaking constituency. Because Jack used to be a youth member of the ADL, I think he's a youth member of the Communist Party. So the appeal is not to the voters of Hong Lim, but to the communist underground of Hong Lim. And so when Dr. Po goes to talk to Jack Yen Thong before the election, Jack says, I will win because the underground is behind me. And of course, unfortunately, the PAP were crushed in Hong Lim. Now, as a result of this, Lee Kuan Yew gets worried. The MCP is either ineffectual, or it can't command its supporters, or its supporters no longer are listening, or maybe the MCP is playing him, they're not listening to him, but he can't count on the MCP. So what can he do? He no longer has his own electoral base. The trade unions are reluctant to support him unless he resolves the detainee issue to their satisfaction, and the MCP cannot or will not support him. So he goes to the British and he asks for help. Your loss is your own fault. They say it's because you're just so arrogant. If you just have a more humane and understanding leadership to Singapore, that will help a lot. And it's just one by-election loss. You have an overwhelming majority in the Legislative Assembly, and every government at this time, experiences a loss of support, right? It's typical. It happens. But they're really shocked because Lee is obsessed with Lim Chin Siong. He blames Lim Chin Siong for his defeat. And the British are very worried by this. And so Lee needs an issue on which to regain PAP popularity. And he needs an issue on which he can regain his own authority. He needs an issue which everyone agrees with, the equivalent of mother's milk and apple pie, something that you can't disagree with. It's like democracy. Everyone is a fan of democracy, right? But the problem is, a lot of the popular issues are very hard to deliver. You can't turn the economy around in just one election cycle. Housing takes years to build. Crime, it continues to rise. But there is one issue which is universally popular. Almost everyone in Singapore wants it, and that's merger. Merger is going to be his panacea. And so he goes to the British, and the British, because they want their naval base in Singapore, they want their political and strategic interests in Singapore to be protected. They're happy, they want merger, they've wanted merger for a long time. But you can't have merger without the Federation of Malaya, and so the Tunku has to agree. And so they go to the Tunku and they say there's a communist conspiracy in Singapore. If you don't take in Singapore, Singapore will become a Cuba on your doorstep. It will become a source of instability. And of course, the Tunku is very reluctant because, as we know, politics in Malaysia is based on racial voting blocks, and bringing in Singapore, which is a much more progressive, has a much more progressive electorate, will lead to problems for the Tunku. It'll destabilize his electoral base. It's different if he knew the Chinese will all vote for the MCA, but they're much more progressive, they're much more liberal, and so there's no guarantee that they will support him. So he's very reluctant. But after a lot of persuasion, and especially after the British then bribed him basically by offering him the Borneo territories, right, with all their natural resources, with all the oil, then the Tunku eventually says okay. So he comes to Singapore and he gives his famous 27th of May 1961 speech. The problem is, right, in the history of Singapore, this speech is seen as this huge bombshell. But for the people of Singapore, it wasn't. The Tunku had made this sort of statement that Singapore should have a closer association with the Federation many times before, over and over again. So for the people of Singapore, if you read the newspapers, it was just a big shrug. Oh, there goes the Tunku again. Right? You know, what is different this time? They didn't realize he was signaling to the British and to the PAP government that this is different. And of course, right after this, Malaya won the Thomas Cup, and then with the Bukit Ho Swee fire, so attentions moved on. At the time, and in the impending Anson by-election, people are still talking about merger as if it's going to be 10 years away, right? This ideal that we don't know when we'll achieve. But at the end of June, the news leaked. British actions betrayed the fact that stuff was happening. And word got out, and people erupted in shock and horror. Wait, we're going to merge with the Federation? There's going to be a Malaysia? What on earth is going on? And within the PAP, which is the party of government, there is even more shock. This whole issue is compounded by the fact that they're in power and the government has not consulted the party at all. Right? You're going to fundamentally change the nature of Singapore, its constitution, its whole way of life, and you're not talking to your own party, you're not talking to your own cabinet, you're not talking to parliament, or rather the legislative assembly. What is going on? So there were genuine fears that the Singapore was being sold out, that we would exchange one colonial master, the British, for another, the Federation. And so there was all this anger. At best, the leadership, Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee were irresponsible, right? At worst, they're selling out the country. And merger becomes central to the Anson by-election. And the progressive lefts try and force Lee to clarify his stand on merger. And again, Lee refuses. They say, we need you to clarify your stand on merger, on the detainees, and to return to the platform on which the PAP was elected in 1959. And Lee, in return, and Toh Chin Chai and the rest of the cabinet attacked the left, and they called them traitors. So, in the Anson by-election, the PAP lose an easily winnable seat. And the public elect David Marshall, whom the Chinese newspapers call the biggest cannon in the available arsenal. They want someone who will speak out, who will ensure that merger is done properly. At this point, of course, Lee is desperate. He begs the British for a timetable on merger, and the British refuse. They say, if we give you a firm timetable, it will look as if we are railroading the Borneo territories into merger. But the Borneo territories, the Cobble Commission must be given time to determine whether the Borneo territories are willing to join Malaysia. So Lee threatens to resign, and he says, I'll resign and you can have a more left-wing government. And the British look at him and go, no, you won't. And they call his bluff. So then he proposes crazy schemes. He says, okay, I will instruct the special branch, I will command the release of detainees, and then you countermand it. That way I can say, look, I tried to release the detainees and the British stopped me. And the British refuse. They say, and this is almost a direct quote, we cannot continue supporting your lies. He then says, okay, there is a secret ISC document from August 1959 in which I propose the release of detainees. How about I release this document and then it will show that I tried in August 59 and I failed. And Selkirk is very offended by this for two reasons. The first is that in his very first meeting as ISC chairman, he says the most important principle of the Internal Security Council is confidentiality. Whatever happens, we must not reveal what goes on in here. But the second reason is because in August 59, Lee introduced this paper where he calls for the release. In the very next meeting, Lee then asks the ISC to vote against his own paper and stop the release, so that his government would not, and I quote, soil their hands. So Lee was blocking the release of detainees, and this document is deceptive. So, you can see what Selkirk says here. And in response, after Selkirk refuses, Lee accuses him of being selfish. But it's not just Selkirk who's upset. The Tunku is furious. He calls Lee, and I quote, spineless. He says, and I quote, I can never trust this man again. And in spite of all this, Lee then calls for a special meeting of the Legislative Assembly on the 20th of July 1961. Now, before the announcement goes out, the Progressive Left and Selkirk are meeting at Eden Hall. Now, who initiated the meeting is of some dispute, and I urge you to read Dr. Po's chapter in the book about it. But what is for sure is that both sides expected the Lee Kuan Yew cabinet to fall soon, and the Progressive Left would have to form the next government. So they were sizing each other up. And the Progressive Left asked Selkirk, if we win the next election, if we take power constitutionally, will you arrest us? Is the constitution just for Lee Kuan Yew, or is it open to anyone who commands the support of Singapore's electorate? And Selkirk plays it straight. He says, if you follow the constitution, if you follow the law, then you will not be arrested. No problem, you can form the next government. That's the law. 2 days later, you have the vote of no confidence in the Legislative Assembly. The PAP backbenchers, the left, demand to know about merger, and they demand to know about the detainees. And Lee says, look, if I release the detainees, it will offend the Tunku, and then we won't have merger. And the left say, hold on a second, are you the government of Singapore? Do you represent the people of Singapore? Or do you represent the Tunku? Whose side are you on here? You represent the people of Singapore, you should be fighting for Singaporean rights. You should be releasing detainees, protecting the rights of Singaporeans for free speech and free action. So in response, Toh Chin Chai tables the August 1959 document, which called for the release of detainees. And Selkirk and the Tunku are furious. They're really, really angry. But they want merger. They don't want the Progressive Left, so they remain silent. The left wing abstain from the vote, and they're expelled. And 2/3 of the PAP leave the party and go, and in August 61, they form the Barisan Sosialis. And now, at this point, this is the nadir of Lee's fortunes. He is a overwrought state, terrible mental state. He's desperate. He comes up with crazy schemes. He says, I will invite a Russian delegation to Singapore, it will trigger a constitutional crisis, and then you, the British, will have to take over. And the British lose a lot of faith on him. But what alternatives do they have? The only other group that can command the support of the electorate of Singapore, of the people of Singapore, are the Barisan, and the British do not want the Barisan. And this belief is cemented when, in opposition, the Barisan articulate a non-aligned and independent political and economic policy, a Singapore First policy. They say Singapore's government should look after Singaporeans. Now, the British want Singapore to protect the Singapore government to protect the British political and economic interests and their naval base. So they have no alternative here. They have to stick with Lee. But in response to the formation of the Barisan, the Tunku demands the arrest of Singapore's political opposition. He's openly afraid of what the Barisan can do in a unified Malaysia. He talks about the incredible organizational abilities of the Barisan and about Lim Chin Siong's talismanic abilities. There's one word from Lim Chin Siong, and he'll organize all the Chinese against him. He has to preserve UMNO dominance. But of course, he doesn't want to be responsible. He doesn't want to be seen as this authoritarian dictator either. So he wants arrest before Malaysia is created, so they can start Malaysia on a clean slate, all hunky-dory. He doesn't have to do anything. And the British say, look, we can't do that. But the Tunku reminds them that, look, you told me there's a communist conspiracy in Singapore. If these people are communists, then what's the problem with arresting them? Remember, in 1948, we wanted you to arrest the communists in Malaya, and you refused. You said, let the democratic process play out. And then we had all these years of the emergency. If you had listened to us in 1948, we wouldn't have the emergency. So listen to us now, arrest these people. And if they're not communists, then why do we need Malaysia? So the British are caught. And their response is that we don't have proof. Because the British colonial reputation was badly tarnished by scandals in 1959, particularly out of Nyasaland, which today is Malawi, and Kenya. So the British response is to say we don't have evidence. But Selkirk privately admits that to his minister that if the Federation absolutely insists on arrest, we cannot say no. So their only real strategy here is to play for time. They keep talking, and they hopefully, eventually, it will show the arrest to be unnecessary. And Selkirk also argues, look, we can't do the arrest now because the white paper on merger has not been passed through the assembly in Singapore yet. If we arrest people now, it will seem like we are trying to influence the political process and rig it. So we cannot do the arrest now. So his goal is to keep all sides talking. The PAP position is, Lee Kuan Yew wants to stay in power. But he does not want responsibility for the arrest because he's mindful of what happened to Lim Yew Hock's government after '56. When the arrest happened, Lim Yew Hock's party lost a lot of popularity and now they're reduced to just a few MPs, assemblymen. So he says the arrest should happen after merger, then the central government in KL can take responsibility, not me. Now the Barisan keep their heads down because Selkirk has told them that as long as you play by the rules, you won't be arrested. So they take him at his word and they wait for the merger white paper to be released. And when it comes out in December that year, they're horrified. Because Singapore actually loses rights that it currently enjoys. And in exchange, it will be underrepresented in Kuala Lumpur. As I think it was Lim said this at the time, Singapore would be robbed and then turn around to the thief and thank them and pay them for the privilege of being robbed. So, not only that, but this whole structure that Lee Kuan Yew has negotiated means that the internal security laws will be in the hands of a Kuala Lumpur government which is openly hostile to Singapore's left. And that perhaps is the reason why they oppose the shape of merger so strongly, because at the end of the day, if the manifestation of colonialism in Singapore is the ability for the British or the government to arrest anyone they like, and those powers are in the hands of a government which is not representative of the people of Singapore, which is not democratically elected, which is not responsible to the people of Singapore, then you still have colonialism. So when it becomes clear that the goal of merger is to transfer this internal security power from the British hands to Federation government hands, then from their perspective, it is still colonialism. It doesn't matter whether the colonial masters are the British or the Federation, this manifestation of internal security, arbitrary arrests, means colonialism still exists. Now, if Singapore was equally represented in the government in KL, that would be a different matter. So the Barisan say, okay, what we want is merger. If we want merger, we'll have merger, but Singapore must be equally represented on the basis of population in the Federation, in the federal government, full unconditional merger with all Singapore citizens becoming full citizens of Malaysia on an equal basis with all the other states, so that internal security is in the hands of a representative, responsible government. And the PAP says, look, the Tunku will never accept this, and it will strip Singapore citizens of their rights, because the rules for citizenship in Malaysia are tighter than the rules in Singapore. So around a third of Singapore's people will lose their citizenship. This is the best deal we can get, and you all should be happy with it. And the Barisan say, what kind of logic is that? As the government of Singapore, you're supposed to be protecting Singaporeans' rights, not trading it away and then having us underrepresented. This arrangement gives Singaporeans less freedom, fewer rights. But instead of sticking to this line, right, this merger white paper means less freedom, fewer rights, the Barisan say, fine, if that's your position, then we'll go for full independence now, with merger to come later. And this just confuses people. I think people want merger, they don't want independence. They see Malaya as this inalienable, indivisible, one united country that has been split in two. So they want to go back, they want reunification. So the people get confused. And the problem is the PAP want merger and the people want merger. This is where I think the Barisan really make their big mistake, because instead of pushing a very simple line, right? Merger means less freedom and fewer rights. They get bogged down in details. The debate over the next few months is all about the structure of merger, it's about details of citizenship, it's all about who gets what, where, when. But because Lee has access to the Tunku, he can navigate around any objection just by going to the Tunku and negotiating a compromise. Or he can simply come back and say the Tunku will never have it, so if you want that, we'll never have merger. And so armed with this, Lee is able to craft a form of merger specifically to appeal to Singapore's electorate. He crafts a form of merger that he knows the public will desire. And in particular, the Chinese-speaking majority of Singapore, who want to protect their hard-won rights in education, in labour, and their citizenship. So, he plays to people's self-interest. He actually says at one point, my job is to get what my people want. Now, many of you are familiar with the twists and turns of merger, and it will take too long to go into all the details, but the central issue for me, I think, is that this is a major tactical error for the Barisan, because they can never articulate a realistic alternative form of merger because they don't have access to the Tunku. And of course, merger seems to be a one-off opportunity, because if you remember, the Tunku had been growing less and less enthusiastic about merger after 57. So this seems like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. As you can see here from this comic which appeared in the Barisan newsletter, marry him before he refuses you. Right? If they don't grab it now, will it ever come around again? But there is one area in which the PAP are vulnerable to criticism, and that's the fact that they are not putting this form of merger, structural merger, before the people of Singapore to decide. So in January 1962, Goh Keng Swee commits the PAP to a referendum. This enables them to buy some time because the Cobalt Commission hasn't finished what it's doing in Borneo, but it also enables them to say to the Federation that we can't do the arrest now because it will make us look like we're trying to rig the referendum. In Legislative Assembly, you can't lose because the Alliance Party has been instructed to vote with the PAP where necessary to hold the situation. So the PAP has a rock-solid majority. But if you take it out to the people, the Barisan have the advantage. How do you know you will win? And Lee Kuan Yew says, don't worry, I will make sure that every other option on the ballot is worse than mine. He calls this his Hobson's choice. And the British and the Federation dislike this. The Tunku, when he hears of this, calls this a dirty game. Selkirk says this is a dishonest maneuver. But they want Malaysia, so they keep silent. In the meantime, the Federation keeps demanding arrests. And the British keep saying there's no case, there's no evidence. We can't arrest them without evidence. It's not illegal to be a communist in Singapore. So the Federation seek to build a case. Tunku summons Lee to Kuala Lumpur and he says, if you don't agree to arrest before merger, then Malaysia is off and you can go face the public in the next elections on your own. So Lee is, quote, thoroughly frightened, unquote, and agrees to arrest before merger. Together, they tell their special branches to come up with a document that summarizes the case against the progressive left. And then they send this document to the British, who take one look at it, and Selkirk says this is more an attack on a political party than on a communist. But he wants to be fair. So he takes this document and he gives it to the professionals. He gives it to MI5. He gives it to the security liaison officer, who's the head of the MI5 office in Singapore, Maurice Williams. And for those of you who were at the talk on Saturday, you know what happens next. But what you will not have seen is the actual report itself, and here it is. It was just declassified a few years ago, and he makes 4 points. The first is that in spite of intensive investigations, no evidence has been obtained of Communist Party of Malaya directions to open United Front workers as to how they should carry out their activities. The paper's conclusions are entirely sermons. Line right here. Second, he says, merely having the same goal as the communists does not make someone a communist. Everyone in Singapore wants independence. The communists want independence. Does that make everyone a communist? His third point is that he knows the massive breadth and scale of this, Communist United Front. And he says it's inconceivable that special branch investigations would have failed to yield any evidence of such control and directions. And fourth, right, the label Communist United Front is so broadly applied that it refers to anyone unhappy with the government. So, in conclusion then, he says the special branch paper is wrong, and on the next page, he says the developments since August 1961 outline paper do not support his conclusion. And on the next page, he advises strongly against the arrest and any provocation of the left. He says we're winning, basically, that if they stay in Parliament, if they stay in the Assembly, they get outvoted. If they get frustrated and take to the streets, then we have an excuse to arrest them. So it's a win-win for us. We don't need to do any arrests. So Selkirk comes to the same conclusion, and unable to do the arrests as they want, Special Branch then embarks on a campaign of provocation to try and force the arrest to happen. Legal meetings are banned, and then they're broken up by the police. Activists are harassed. Newspaper editors are arrested and held and then, released. Some newspapers are shut down. Now, when Toh Chin Chai actually learns of the Special Branch paper, right, because he hadn't been, remember Lee Kuan Yew and Goh Keng Swee do all this basically in secret, and they don't tell the rest of the cabinet. So when Toh Chin Chai is shown the Special Branch paper by the British, he actually reacts with horror. He makes the same point that Maurice Williams made. He says, we're winning. In the Assembly we win, take to the streets we also win. So why do we need the arrest? And I'm having such a hard time holding together the party. He's party chairman, right? He says, if people learn of this paper, not only the party may split a third time, the cabinet might split a third time. And the British ask him, you should tell Lee Kuan Yew this. And Toh goes, no. Please, I beg of you, he says, resist Lee's desire for the arrest. But whatever you do, don't tell Lee I said that. Now, Lee and the Tunku are also trying to exploit cracks on the British side. And in particular, they go over Selkirk's head to the Colonial Secretary Reginald Maudling and to the British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. And they try and convince them of the necessity of arrest so that they overrule Selkirk. But instead of convincing them of the arrest, Macmillan actually questions Lee closely and gets Lee to admit, and this is minted, that the left-wing trade unions are no more communist than the Electrical Trades Union in the UK, i.e. just a left-wing pressure group. But all this changes on the 13th of July 1962 when you have a big cabinet reshuffle known as the Night of Long Knives. Maudling becomes Chancellor of the Exchequer, and Duncan Sands, who is Secretary of State for the Commonwealth Relations Office, gets also joint responsibility and becomes also jointly Secretary of State for the Colonial Office, has both offices. So power is concentrated in this one person, and so the next time the Tunku and Lee go to London to meet him at the end of July, they meet a very different atmosphere because Sands is a big fan of federation. He's worked very hard at Tunku on federation, and this is a period where the British are real fans of federation. So you have the Central African Federation, you have the West Indies Federation, and now they want the Malaysian Federation. They see it as a big, secure, friendly entity absorbing small trouble spots. Good solution, they believe. So Sands carefully outlines this path forward. He says, I cannot be put in a position where I can be said to have agreed in advance to arrest without having considered the case of individuals concerned. But if the ISC decides that the arrests are necessary, I will not interfere. Every case has to be made out and considered on its individual merits. And if everyone else is prepared to take their share of responsibility, so we have joint responsibility for the arrest, then the British government will not shirk their responsibility. And the Federation asks him, well, what about Selkirk? And he says, you must leave me to deal with my representative. And Lee Kuan Yew presses him and says, but you do concede there's an internal security threat in Singapore. And San carefully replies, I do not know about any subversive threat as such, but you may find my performance better than it is today. So arrests are basically inevitable from this point. All they need is an excuse. Lee returns to Singapore and calls the referendum. And for those of you who are familiar with what happened, right, the government strains its resources to the legal limit. They use government money, government resources to support option A, the PAP option. But at the same time, the traditional Malay, Indian, Chinese leadership in Singapore also come out in favor of option A because from their point of view, this is the best option. It protects the Singapore's economy, it protects the hard-won education rights because, of course, in Malaysia, Chinese schools, there are no nationally, federally funded Chinese schools anymore. It's all private education. It's a huge disaster. But Singapore, there still are. So they come out in favor of option A because it protects the important rights, education, labor, and their own citizenship. Remember, many of the traditional Chinese leadership are also foreign-born. So if Singapore didn't have these protections, they would lose their citizenship. And the media comes out in favor of these options too. It's the best option. And so the PAP win. And once the PAP win, I think, again, this is a mistake by the Barisan, this matter of opinion, but the Barisan repudiate the results of the referendum. They say the PAP cheated. They say it's a dishonest referendum. And however, their behavior does show a shift because their rhetoric, their public rhetoric, now turns and orients to Malaya. And they say, we will seek to build an alliance of left-wing socialist forces in Malaya. They talk about their future in Malaya. So you can see actually they are reorienting themselves. But before the ISC can meet to discuss and approve all these individual cases for the arrest, the Brunei Rebellion breaks out, 3rd December 1962. And here is where I think, the Brunei Rebellion breaks out, and what happens is that immediately it's pointed out that a few days before the rebellion, the leader of the rebellion, the leader of the Brunei Parti Rakyat, A.M. Azahari, came to Singapore and asked Lim Chin Siong for lunch. So they go to Zhonghua restaurant on Prinsep Street, and seated at a nearby table is the head of special branch, George Bogas, along with a few of his officers, including a young Indian gentleman named S.R. Nathan. And they're openly observing what's happening. And Lim Chin Siong knows. He looks over, he nods at Bogas nods back at him, right? And so at the lunch, Azahari says, hey, I am going to organize this rebellion, and I want you to join in, And Lim Chin Siong says, oh no, this is not for us, no thank you. And Lim Chin Siong goes back to the headquarters round the corner on Middle Road, right? And he says to his colleagues, this Azahari is crazy. He wants to take on the British Empire, he wants to have armed rebellion, and he wants us to join in. And Special Branch know this because they have a spy in the Barisan who's writing reports for them, right? But despite the fact that they think Azahari is crazy, the day after the rebellion, they released this statement that it's a popular uprising and must command the support of all genuine anti-colonialists. And Lee and the Federation leaders are ecstatic. They say, we have them now. By releasing this statement, they have openly supported violent subversion. We can justify the arrest of the Barisan on the basis of this statement. Lee calls this a heaven-sent opportunity. Now, the question has been in the historiography, why did the Barisan support the rebellion if they didn't actually want to organize violent rebellion themselves? In a word, consistency. Lim Chin Siong said, right, in a speech on 23rd December, colonialism is colonialism, basically. You don't stop being anti-colonial just because you're afraid of getting arrested. That just makes you a hypocrite. You must have consistency of principle. And also consistency of practice. They had previously issued statements in support of left-wing revolution in British colonies like Aden and Cyprus and Southern Africa, as well as in Algeria and Congo and West Area. The last one in January 1962 was actually moved in the assembly and it was unanimously passed. Of course, even the PAP voted for it. So they have released statements like these so many times before and nothing happened. Why should anything happen now? On the other hand, if they don't release it, then they'll just be hypocrites. But as we've seen, the British were looking for an arrest, a reason to arrest them. In the past they weren't, but now they were. And it really didn't matter what they said. You know, in Sarawak, the United People's Party of Sarawak condemned the violence and their leaders still got arrested. In Malaysia, Sosialis said nothing about this and they still got arrested. So really, it doesn't really matter what they said or didn't say. The British just needed that excuse. And the Tunku one needed its excuse. So Selkirk telegram sends and he asked for permission to conduct the arrest. And again, here's the telegram, which was also declassified a few years ago. And look closely at it. He spends all of this basically saying, right, that it is now impossible to deny the Federation the arrest that they so badly crave. And he devotes this whole long explanation to it. He says, there's no way we can do this. You know, if the Federation, if we don't do the arrest now, the Federation will accuse us of acting in bad faith. And then at the bottom, he tucks in this couple of lines saying, we have new evidence that the Barisan Socialists are communist controlled and they see no feasible alternative to constitutional tactics now, but they would not hesitate to take it if it would pay. And this is the final piece of the puzzle, because until this year, right, we didn't know what security intelligence he was referring to. But a few months ago, this was released. And this is the evidence. It's two meetings at the Barisan Socialist headquarters on the 23rd and 30th of September. And in particular, the discussion focuses on a statement by Lim made at a speech, where he says, so long as the conditions for peaceful, constitutional methods of struggle remain available to us, we will persist in the peaceful, constitutional method of struggle. Of course, he said it in Chinese, so there could be some dispute, but the translation is generally correct. And from this, Selkirk says, look, Lim is not ruling out violence. Never mind that the British themselves never ruled out violence. Lim is not ruling out violence. Okay, so, fair point, right? Or is it? What's the context for this quote? It's actually from a speech Lim made to the Barisan in the wake of the referendum loss on the 12th of September 1962, and this is the full quote. I'll give you a moment to read. So if you look at it, it's clear Lim is being taken out of context. His emphasis throughout the speech is, how do we stop the PAP from cheating? And how do we restore faith in the democratic system? This is the opposite of what Selkirk is saying. Why is Lim saying this? Because Lim knows the only way his party will ever win power in Malaysia is through free and fair elections, if the people are allowed to freely and democratically express their will. He's not stupid. He knows what happens when people arm themselves and go up against the British Empire. He's just seen it happen. What he wants is to preserve the integrity of the constitutional system, and more importantly, preserve public faith in the constitutional system. And he's actually holding back people in his party who are frustrated and angry. And actually, if you read on, right, you reach the point where Lim is actually asked, well, what happens if there are arrests and detentions? And this is his reply. He basically says, as long as the unfair and undemocratic ordinances still exist, there will be no guarantee for basic freedom and democratic rights. And there's always the possibility of repression. As long as the law is on the books, the government will be tempted to use it. If you have a tool, there's the old saying, if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So he's saying, we need to prepare for the worst. We must be calm. We must work slowly. And he says specifically, do not fall for the provocation. Do not attack. Again, in a speech, in the 23rd December speech, he reiterates, only a fool would want violence. But this is 1962, remember. Algeria has just won her freedom through a long drawn-out war with France. The US had tripled its forces in Vietnam in 1960 and again in 1961. It seems inevitable that violent revolution might be the only way to expel colonialists in many parts of the world. They don't want violence, but the colonial state can shoot them at any time and it would be completely legal. His point is, if the state doesn't come and shoot us first, then we will adhere to peaceful constitutional struggle. And really, for the time, I think it's a very reasonable position. Of course, the INC don't care. Their goal is arrests, and the arrests aren't about security, it's about politics. So Operation Coldstore is scheduled for 16 December, right? And all the individual cases are just waved through. You know, in the minutes of the meeting where the individual cases for arrest are put up, Lee Kuan Yew says, oh, I haven't even had time to read them. And Ismail, the Malayan Federation Minister for Internal Security, says, oh, it doesn't matter what the cases are as long as we arrest all of them. But it fails at the last minute because Lee, for his own political survival, inserts 15 names of his political opponents. And the Tunku erupts in fury. He says, this untrustworthy man. And they refuse to back down, despite the British trying to convince either one of them to back down. So the operation fails, and Lee goes off to the Cameron Highlands to play golf with Norodom Sihanouk. Now, with Lee away, nothing can be agreed, so they just sit and stew until early January when Lee comes back. And when he comes back, he has a whole new story. He says, you know, if I had agreed to the arrest, the Tunku would have no incentive to go through with merger. So I want a written guarantee from the Tunku that he will go through a merger if I agree to the arrest. In his autobiography, Lee actually says this was his position all along. But if you look at the documents, the correspondence, Lee doesn't say any of this at the time, only when he comes back. It's clear, I think, that in my opinion, this is something he came up with while playing golf, you know, or at least on holiday. So Selkirk says, are you crazy? Sukarno is really pressuring the Tunku so heavily regarding Malaysia as a neo-colonial construct. And now you're going to question the Tunku's integrity? You're going to say his word as a Malay gentleman is worthless? Are you trying to destroy Malaysia? So instead, Lee says, okay, the press statement that will be released after Operation Coldstore should refer to Malaysia. And there's a lot of back and forth about this, and finally they agree, and this enables Lee to say, okay, well, you know, my hands were tied because the arrest, Malaysia was dependent on the arrest, so I didn't want the arrest, but, you know, we want merger, and in order for merger to happen, we have the arrest. Major concession. But of course, at the last minute, Lee again inserts 3 names into the arrest list. 3 members of the United People's Party. He wants to cripple Ong Eng Guan. And again, right, he openly admits that it was to strengthen his own chances of political survival. Right, and the Director of Special Branch admitted he had been directed specifically by the Prime Minister to select several members of the UPP for arrest, and that it would never have occurred to Special Branch to propose those names. Selkirk objects to this, right? He says you can't just arrest people who have nothing to do with the situation, right? You can't manipulate this for politics. But Tunku and Sandi's refuse to back him up. Tunku and Sands refuse to back him up. They say we've come too far to let Malaysia fail over just 3 names. So Selkirk has no choice but to agree, and Coldstore happens on the 2nd of February. So we come full circle to this statement. And so we can see, we now know, the first one is not true, the second reason here is not true, the third is inserted for Lee's benefit, and the last one is true. But, manipulated. So, let's conclude. Who are the progressive left? They're a generation of men who have a very clear and understandable focus on arbitrary arrest and detention as the greatest manifestation of colonialism in Singapore. They articulate a very progressive, non-aligned, Singapore-centric basis for their policies. And throughout this period, they remain committed to the constitutional process because they know it's the only way they will ever achieve power. But when you look back, their one shot, I think, was to win the referendum. And that way, any arrest after that would have made it look like it was an attempt to destroy genuine opposition in Malaysia, but they lost the referendum. Why? I think, number one, because they got bogged down by detail. But also, once you get bogged down in detail, you have to be able to articulate something convincing. A convincing alternative was never going to be forthcoming. I think that, with all due respect to Dr. Poh, they're not very experienced. I mean, they've been in opposition their whole lives. And they're chiefly trade unionists and doctors, people with strong moral fiber, not people like the PAP who are led by, lawyers who know about the law. Okay, I'm not going to imply that lawyers don't have moral fiber. They know about Lee Kuan Yew knows about the law, right? And he's assisted by academics and civil servants who know about the system. And I think also they misunderstood the public mood. When you have a generation who are so scarred by detention, right, detention to them is the most important thing. But the public at large has not gone through detentions. Instead, they're concerned education, jobs, their own citizenship rights. And that was the priority. And so they're willing to make that trade-off of less representation to preserve those rights. So, the purpose of merger in Malaysia was to remove, chiefly, the number one reason was to remove political opposition in Singapore. And it is in these roots that lie the failure of Malaysia and Singapore's separation, because the merger process turned Malaya from this inalienable, indivisible ideal, this right of the people of Malaya, into a political arrangement to be made and unmade where convenient politically. And Lee's campaign, right, on the basis of racialism and chauvinism and communism, also encouraged the Federation leadership to fear Singapore's Chinese by justifying all their worst stereotypes of Singapore's Chinese. And so when Singapore is in Malaysia, Lee, objects to the fact that all these things are then turned against him. Kind of naive, I suppose. And perhaps most significantly, the process of merger actually destroys the personal relationships of the leaders involved. Throughout the merger process, right, 61 to 63, Lee's relationship with Thum slowly breaks down. By the time merger happens, they can barely stand each other. And somehow the British think that this constitutional arrangement can constrain and contain the two of them. But what is made can be unmade. Meanwhile, Selkirk's relationship with Lee also breaks down. In fact, after Coldstore, Selkirk never again meets with Lee Kuan Yew on a non-official basis. He always sends his deputy Philip Moore to meet Lee. He only sees Lee officially in the ISC and official meetings. He can't stand Lee. So what are the enduring consequences then? Well, the opportunity for Malaysia has been lost for generations. In fact, in Leaders of Singapore, Dr. Melanie Chu's interview with Lim Chin Siong, he says there were two great objectives: independence and unity. And we got one, but we lost the other. But to return to the goal of our evening tonight, as a result of the pioneering model of Coldstore, repression has become part of the governing model in Singapore. Before Coldstore, Lee was genuinely terrified of the consequences of repression. He was genuinely terrified of the verdict of the people. But after Coldstore, he freely indulged. So let me conclude by reading a now famous quote of Lee's. And if you've heard this talk before, you'll have heard it many times. But repression, here we go, repression is like making love. It's always easier the second time. The first time there may be pangs of conscience, a sense of guilt. But once embarked on this course with constant repetition, you get more and more brazen in the attack and in the scope of the attack. First, you attack only those whom your special branch can definitely say are communists. They have no proof, except what X told Z, told Alpha, who told Beta, who told the special branch. Then, you attack those whom your special branch say are actively sympathizing with and helping the communists, although they are not communists themselves. Then you attack those whom your special branch say, although they are not communists or fellow travelers, yet by their intransigent opposition to any collaboration with colonialism, they encourage the spirit of revolt and weaken constituted authority, and thereby, according to special branch, they are aiding the communists. Then finally, since you have gone that far, you attack all those who oppose you. Repression is an easy substitute for hard work and organization. It's a clever man, Mr. Lee. He predicted his own future. Thank you very much.